Hey folks, David Stewart here. The recent death of Steve Ditko, the artist who created The Amazing Spider-Man, has got me thinking a little bit more about the problems with corporate IP ownership. So today I'd like to present to you an idea. I call this the 5 phases of corporate IP ownership. And what do I mean by that term? Well, I mean the ownership of a set of intellectual properties. In this case, I'm talking about artistic intellectual properties like Spider-Man, by a corporation rather than by an individual or the artist who actually created them. And because they're owned by a corporation rather than the artist who created them, you end up with an interesting cycle that I've seen repeated in many different franchises. The first phase of this cycle is the creation phase. This is when a new individual or group of creators create a new property, and it's usually done for hire, which means when they create it, it becomes the ownership of the corporation that's funding their particular endeavor. And it's usually a low-budget affair. It's brought to market rather cheaply, maybe a one-off issue of a comic, maybe a fairly low-budget movie that's not expected to return a whole lot of investment. And the reason it's low budget is because the corporation is looking at something that's an unexpected return. It's unestablished, it's brand new, and therefore you don't know how much money it's capable of making. Phase 2 is the explosion phase. This is when the property explodes in popularity unexpectedly. You can think like Star Wars, which only opened in a couple of theaters and then grew by word of mouth into something that became its own phenomenon. The corporation in step 2 of phase 2 immediately moves to capitalize on the growth, pushing the creators to make a follow-up work. In this case, something like Aliens. And that explosion phase can produce some really amazing movies. Think of some of your favorite sequels. They're happening in the explosion phase for the most part. Next comes phase 3, which is the milking phase. And in the milking phase, the creators, having experienced success, demand more money for their contributions. The corporation, understanding that future sales in media are based more on past success than they are on the actual quality of the media that you're being produced, because consumers can't judge the quality of it until they buy it. They refuse the deal. They refuse to give the original creators more money, and they opt to bring in new, younger, cheaper labor to continue the franchise in the absence of the original creators. The original creators, which are now able to negotiate higher premiums for their work on the open market, leave the company and go work on future projects, either self-financing them or working for another company at a higher pay rate. They move on. Second step of the milking phase begins in earnest. The types of media produced are amplified. You get books, comics. You get movie adaptations of comics. You get many different variations of what the original product was in order to milk it. You have many sequels, many different variations on what the original successful movie happened to be. You have merchandise that's really quickly rolled out in order to capitalize on the gains of the popularity of the original franchise. And during this milking phase, you begin to experience the decline. The next entries into the franchise have a notable drop in quality, but are successful at the box office and usually with children, mostly because they don't know what they're getting before they buy it, and they're banking on the past success. They're banking on the quality that they've already seen to provide information for future quality. And so the milking continues. The decline of the intellectual property continues. As the market for the expanded products shrink, the corporations cut back on production, less toys, less comics. The future franchise entries have lower budgets. And eventually you enter what I call phase 4, which is the death or hibernation phase. You have a franchise that finally dies. You may have studios keep writers on staff if they're making movies, but production never begins on a movie. Certain sequels may be caught in development hell. The last successful creators of the franchise move on to do other things, and the back catalog continues to be fairly successful and continues to generate interest. In something like comics, you have a titular character during the death phase, maybe make guest appearances in other series without having a series of his own to star in. That goes on for an indeterminate amount of time before you enter what I call phase 5, which is the reboot phase. A reboot phase is after a certain amount of time has passed. Once the franchise has disappeared for a while, the studio recognizes that consumers still enjoy the first entries of the franchise, and the lack of popularity of follow-up entries to the franchise may have been forgotten. And with the power of contemporary nostalgia, they make a risk assessment and determine that a reboot, a sequel, or a requel, which is a reboot sequel, would be a profitable risk. They also know that people are likely to forget a lot of the bad things about the past and really hope for a return to form, having had a big break where there hasn't been any media. That there's a belief by consumers that studios are not going to commit unless they are able to create a better product than what came before. Step 2 of the phase 5 of reboot is the franchise is revived. The new product comes out. Fans begin hyping the coming product amongst themselves for free. You can think of all the hype that surrounded The Force Awakens. New talented artists are brought on board to produce a high production value movie or high production value toys, comics, TV series, whatever the new version of this is going to happen to be. Old figures from the original movies make cameos and show up in the new versions of these particular movies as a way to let the old fans know that they ought to embrace this new version. They ought to embrace the new reboot because the old people are still on board. Now, in some cases, like with the Ghostbusters 2016 reboot, the old actors were forced through contract negotiations to make cameos in the movie. They didn't support the creation of the movie, but there's other examples. There's Leonard Nimoy appearing in the new Star Trek movies before his death. There's also the appearance of, Han Solo, the older characters from Star Wars in the new requel or sequel trilogy, to draw a thread for old fans to make them believe that there's a continuation of what they liked before happening in the reboot. A new style is also embraced at the same time to entice new fans. However, that may also put off fans. If the reboot is successful, the product hits, consumers respond pretty well. Think of like Force Awakens. The flaws are initially overlooked because of the hype, and the fans are initially pleased. Then the franchise returns directly to the milking phase. In some cases, the reboot is not successful, and then the franchise still returns to the milking phase, but with a shorter duration of it, trying to get the last value for the franchise out before it re-enters hibernation or just full-on death. And this cycle, once it goes back to the milking, will repeat indefinitely until the IP is sold off at a discount or is completely exhausted. And I don't know how long it takes for an intellectual property to be completely exhausted. But at some point, the milking will stop. The consumers will stop being interested in what's there, and you're left wondering what you're going to do to cover the losses. Now, why does this happen? So let me talk a little bit about why this happens. Corporations have a different set of motives than artists. Artists have deeper intrinsic reasons for creating the art that they do. That's part of being an artist. They have soul in the game. When you write a song, you're expressing something fundamentally about yourself. When you create a movie, when you create a story, you're expressing something fundamentally that's important to you, hopefully. And so when the ownership of being able to produce sequels is handed off to a corporation, they don't view the art as something that needs to have soul invested in it, that needs to have meaning behind it. They view it as an asset. And as an asset, it needs to be creating value for the company. So it becomes just a value transaction. How can we create a sequel for less money than we'll make by selling that sequel? How can we produce it and market it for less money than we'll make back in box office and home video sales? That becomes the ultimate game. And then how can we take the popularity of what's there and capitalize it by spreading it into other media and diversifying as much as possible the ways that fans can buy up the stuff. And that's a really different way of approaching a work of art than the way an artist happens to think about it. Artists tend to think about things less in terms of money, not that they're not interested in money, but that their art has meaning. And of course, the problem is if you go back to that first phase, that creation phase, the artists create something with their creative soul in mind. They have soul in the game when they initially create whatever they're trying to put out there, whatever meaning they're trying to impart out into the world or into their art. That's part of what makes it popular. One of the reasons Star Wars was so explosive at the time is it had meaning behind it. It told a story that people were interested in, and yes, it was flashy, and the aesthetics were great, and the special effects were great, but ultimately it told a story that meant something to people. And once you remove the meaning of that, and all you're left with is the flash and the aesthetics and the production value, it ends up being a hollow experience, and consumers can feel that and can respond to those sorts of hollow experiences. And there's so many that you can talk about. Now, I bring up comics, and I start with Steve Ditko because there's been a huge amount of this cycling happening in comics for decades now. Once something is created, it reaches a height of popularity. Then you try to milk it as much as possible until people won't buy the comic anymore. Then it enters the death phase. Then you bring back a new series, or you reboot it, like with the New 52 or something like that. And then the cycle continues. You milk the reboot until people aren't buying the issues anymore. Then you kill it off and you bring something back. You reboot it again. You just reboot as many times as you can until nobody's buying the issues. And I think this is a problem with the comics industry that a lot of comics fans tend to overlook, which is that a lot of the properties are not presenting anything new or original. They're just perpetually in that milking phase, milking the good quality of what came before it without doing anything new. And in a lot of cases, companies are not really willing to let artists and writers create new characters and put them out there and see if people like them, because there's too much risk involved. And when they do it, it has to be done for a low budget. Think of how a corporation thinks about intellectual property. It's an asset. It's not something meaningful in and of itself. So when you look at the comics industry, this cycle happens more quickly than it does in movies, and I think that's because comics are quicker and easier to make than movies. But it happens with movies. We saw it with Alien, the Alien franchise. We saw it with Star Trek. There was a while where there was no Star Trek before the reboot happened. We had this long stretch with no Alien movies before we had like Prometheus and Alien Covenant, which I still haven't seen yet. And this cycle, I see it just continuing in perpetuity, which means the really original stuff is probably going to be created by artists who aren't separate from their art. And artists who own the actual intellectual property that they're creating, that's where you're going to be able to have at least some guarantee of quality going forward. So hopefully you've enjoyed this presentation. Those are the five phases of corporate IP ownership: creation, explosion, milking, death, and reboot. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you think down below about these particular ideas. I'll see you guys next time, and I hope you have a great day.